decades, the world changes. The Iron Curtain descending, the fall of the Berlin Wall, September 11th, the invasion of Ukraine. Today we must be realistic and accept that we are in another era of change. A reappraisal of how nation states interact, how much focus we must place on our defense, and how geopolitics works. At the very least, the Pax Americana of over half a century is evolving, potentially. At the very least, the Pax Americana of over half a century is evolving, potentially even ending. We may be witnessing a more fundamental reset, perhaps a return to the world of the strong and the weak, and in such a world, we must not be weak. Our foreign policy should support our national interest. We should review those alliances, methods, and approaches which served us well for 3 generations. Where they work, we should keep them, and where they do not, they should go. The United Kingdom must accept reality. No one owes us a living. No process is an end in itself. We can no longer hide behind vapid statements that were, at best, ambitious 20 years ago and are now today outright irrelevant. It is time to speak the truth. The world has changed and the UK is not ready. So we must change too. The first thing we must define is our national interest. We need a first principles approach that really recognizes that a nation's primary purpose is to defend its borders, its values, and its people. And as important as other objectives may be, the blunt reality is that everything else must be secondary. National interest means a strong military and a strong economy. A recognition that if our supply chains are overly exposed to those who do not share our values, our country is at risk. That relying upon goodwill is a fool's errand. That genuine long-term prosperity is built from real competitive advantage, not vague aspirations. That peace is obtained through strength. That others, even friends, will ultimately put themselves first. And before the inevitable pearl clutching of those who wish it was still 1995, none of this is a selfish objective. We have lived off the inheritance of Thatcher, Reagan, and Gorbachev for far too long. The world has changed, and we now must be realistic. You simply cannot help others if you cannot help yourself. Strengthening Britain must be the principal objective at the heart of everything we do. That means not elevating internationalism or progressivism above our own national interest. When David Lammy talks about progressive realism, he is not serious. Progressive realism is a contradiction. It means not championing ever more expansive approaches to international law at the expense of British interests. It means recognizing that sovereignty matters, our sovereignty above all. Secondly, we must stop being naive about international affairs. Where partnerships or supranational institutions work for us and deliver in our national interest, we will support them. As a trading nation, we need to protect the rules that underpin global commerce. We should always prioritize closer trading relationships with open economies. As Trade Secretary, I signed the CPTPP trade deal because it was strategically as well as economically beneficial, strengthening our links in the Indo-Pacific where there were concerns around China. So where international alliances strengthen our security, we must continue them. NATO remains vital for European defense, and we must pursue new avenues like AUKUS with our closest allies. But we have let ourselves be fooled into believing that international law alone can keep the peace, that international agreements or institutions are somehow ends in and of themselves. So when faced with regimes with no respect for the law, we need more realism. International law should not become a tool for NGOs and other critics to advance an activist political agenda through international bodies or our courts. Just look at how the ECHR redefined climate protection as a human right, or at the overreach in the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice and the ruling of the International Tribunal for the Law on the Sea on Chagos, or at the UN rapporteurs touring the world claiming that the West is racist and discriminatory when we clearly are not. If international bodies are taken over by activists or by autocratic regimes like China and Russia, we must use our influence to stop them. And if that fails, we will need to disengage. The third thing we must do is get serious within our own nation. We no longer have time for fripperies and inconsequentials. We cannot waste effort on trivia, such as declaring our pronouns or trying to redefine what a woman is. We shouldn't apologize for our past, let alone be discussing paying reparations. Our leaders should not be taking the knee. Young people can no longer be taught to dislike our country, our institutions, and our history so much that they say they wouldn't fight for it. And before someone else again accuses me of fighting culture wars, this goes well beyond personal interest. Every single second that we spend on these matters is a second lost, while our adversaries are advancing. Fourthly, we must be realistic about our failures so we stop repeating them. Despite the loss of so many British lives, Afghanistan fell again to the Taliban. We helped force Gaddafi from power in Libya, but a failed state was left behind. We watched America set red lines for Assad in Syria, and then watched as Assad crossed them. Britain led the world and the West in support for Ukraine. I will always be proud of the support that the last Conservative government gave in the run-up to Putin's invasion and in those first crucial weeks and first few months of the war. We helped prevent Keir falling, and we supported Ukraine in regaining territory that was initially lost to Russia. But it is also true that overall, the West has not done enough to support Ukraine. We were too ineffective, too indecisive, and too often behind the curve. As a result, Putin gained what he needed most: time. We now see the consequences. An end to the war is being negotiated while a fifth of Ukrainian territory is under enemy occupation. The danger is that aggression does not merely go unpunished, but ends up rewarded. Russia and other authoritarian regimes will be emboldened if that is how this war ends. And this is why it is absolutely critical that the Prime Minister succeeds in his talks with President Trump later this week. Fifth, we should not hide behind warm slogans or warm words like soft power or an ethical foreign policy as reasons for not promoting our national interest. If Russia decides that after Ukraine it will try aggression against a NATO member, we will not be saved because of our membership of the International Criminal Court. We need to take a cold, hard look at these agreements we have signed and ask ourselves whether they really serve our national interest today. Yes, some were agreed in the aftermath of the last World War, others during the optimism at the end of the Cold War. And yes, British jurists and diplomats were behind a lot of these developments. But some of these arrangements have mutated out of all recognition. Over the last 20 years, the ECHR rulings morphed so fundamentally that they now limit our ability to control our borders or even fight in wars. And as Dean said earlier, policy exchange has exposed over the last decade in work covering the ICC, lawfare against our armed forces, and the Labour government's surrender of our territory in Chagos. We cannot win a war against an opponent willing to break all the rules while we insist on playing by the most gentle of Queensberry rules. And this takes me to my sixth and final point. We must rebuild, and rebuild quickly. We need to increase defence expenditure significantly. But this is about more than committing to spend a particular percentage of our GDP. Of course, spend does matter, and 2.5% by 2030 was our funded commitment in the last government, but it was a down payment on more. Keir Starmer cancelled our plan and set us back. 2.5% by 2030 is now no longer sufficient. We must rebuild and go further and faster. Rebuilding will be achieved by having a plan to rearm based on an efficient, focused military, equipped with and trained to use the new kinds of weapons we have seen deployed to devastating effect in Ukraine. We also need to be honest enough to admit that military procurement still needs a fundamental redesign to be faster, more responsive, and deliver better value for taxpayers. The message should be simple. We must do what it takes to protect Britain. That means not just our independent nuclear deterrent, but also the ability to protect critical national infrastructure at home and under the sea. It means having the capability required to contribute meaningfully to NATO-led deterrence in Europe. Alongside this, we need to make sure that we have the infrastructure to keep Britain strong. We cannot put virtue signalling ahead of a realistic assessment of our national interest. That means prioritizing our energy security, building our domestic R&D capabilities in key technologies of the future, such as uncrewed vehicles, while learning the lessons of Ukraine that conventional ground strength still matters. It means defending industries vital to our resilience, including arms manufacturing. So we should not be suspending arms licenses to our allies on spurious political grounds. This sends the worst possible signal to countries thinking of buying from our domestic defense industry. And if we approach this challenge of rebuilding as a zero-sum game, as a simple choice between defense spending and public services to back it, there will be painful decisions for the government. There would have been for any government. But any country that spends more on debt interest than it does on defense, as the UK does today, is destined for weakness. I will back the Prime Minister in taking those difficult decisions to increase people. He should consider whether some of the 0.5% currently spent on development aid should be repurposed, at least in the short term, towards defense and security. And he should also look at making welfare savings to fund increased defense expenditure. But one decision shouldn't be difficult. He should scrap his disastrous plan to surrender the Chagos Islands and have British taxpayers pay for the privilege. A key difference between the Prime Minister and I is that I know we need a strong economy so we can pay for defence. We need a serious plan to get the British economy growing again. All of this is connected. We cannot rebuild or rearm while we're hounding farmers and businesses. We need to restore business confidence. We need to reduce the red tape and taxation. We need to remove the disincentives to work from our welfare system. The world has changed, and that familiar geopolitical architecture which we all grew up under is under threat. It's under threat from a new axis of authoritarian powers. It's Russia, China, Iran, and others. And if we fail to respond in the way that I have described, we will face a bitter reckoning sooner or later. 20 years ago, Irving Kristol talked of a conservative being a liberal who was mugged by reality. And on foreign policy, that is exactly what I have been, a conservative. Not a liberal, not a cosmopolitan internationalist, not a neocon, but a conservative realist. I have spoken before about my core belief that Western values of liberalism, those Enlightenment values, need to be fought for. That real classical liberalism of free speech, free trade, free enterprise, and a smaller state that does some things well, like defense, not lots of things badly. These are the conservative values that I hold, that guide everything that I do. And I believe the country our children will inherit will be stronger if we reassert them. For nearly 2 centuries, since Britain emerged from the turmoil of the Napoleonic Wars, the Conservative Party has stood for strong defence. Defence of our national traditions, of monarchy, faith, family, law and order, and individual liberty against every threat we faced, from Nazi Germany to the Soviet Union, Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and now Vladimir Putin. But we conservatives have always believed that the indispensable foundations of strong defense are a strong economy and a confident society that believes in itself and its traditions, and that these are worth defending. We cannot defend them without realism. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I know that we've got questions from the media. I have a list here, and first up is Vicky Young from the BBC. Got a loud voice. Right.
Thank you. Vicky Young, BBC News. If it was you heading to Washington this week to see President Trump, would you be raising any concerns about some of the things he said about Ukraine, about President Zelensky, and also about the fact that last night America aligned with Russia at the UN? Would you be willing to say that to him face to face? Are you at all concerned that other leaders haven't been doing that?
America is an ally, but I've been very clear that I disagree with President Trump when he said that President Zelensky was a dictator. Vladimir Putin is the dictator, and I wouldn't be afraid to say so. But I also would be saying things that he and I would agree with, which is that we need to spend more on defense. And a relationship, even with friends and allies, isn't about just telling people what they want to hear. It's about speaking the truth. But there are so many things that we can cooperate on with the US. I don't think I would be having any problems with those discussions. Thank you. Beth Rigby, Sky.
Thank you. Thank you. Kemi Badenoch, you just talked about authoritarian regimes, talking about China, Iran and Russia. And it comes as the US pivots away from Europe, pivots away from the UK, votes at the Security Council with China and Russia. You just said that the US is an ally, but are you concerned that it is becoming a threat to UK interests? Should we pivot closer to Europe? And just on the ECHR and the International Criminal Court, what are you saying? Are you saying that you now think we should withdraw from these institutions? Thank you.
So Beth, let me be clear. The US is not an authoritarian regime. It shares those same Western values that we share: free trade, free enterprise, free speech. But what we see it doing is acting in its national interests. It is being realistic, and we need to be so too. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to agree on everything. We disagree with them on that resolution, for example. But that is why I want the Prime Minister to be successful in his talks and find out what the thinking was behind that. And when it comes to the ECHR, I have always been very clear that the ECHR should not stop us from doing what is right for the people of this country and what is right in our national interest. And if it continues to do so, at some point we will probably have to leave. What I have not agreed with is deciding that we should leave without having a plan for what that looks like and how to do so in a way that makes sense. We still believe in the rules-based order. We have to, because we are a trading nation. It's the point I made in my speech. I was Trade Secretary for a long time. Without rules, then things just don't work. But other countries are breaking the rules, and we need to get serious about that and not pretend that those things aren't happening. And that's really what I want us to focus on. Chris Hope, GB News.
Chris Hope, GB News. Kemi Badenoch, two quick questions. On Beth's question there, yes or no, will you start work now then on planning to withdraw from the ECHR, given you've given a big hint today you're keen on that idea? You say 2.5% of GDP is not sufficient anymore by 2030 on defence. What's your new target for defence spending?
Thank you, Chris. So last time I was on my show, I was on your show, you asked me that question. So I've already answered that question on live TV. But it's exactly what I said to Beth. We are going to be working on this. I said that I wasn't going to be setting out detailed policy. We are going to start with principles. This speech is about our principles. Realism, conservative realism, is what we're about. Do we need to leave the ECHR? Let's start doing the work to see what can be done. And that's why the policy commissions, which I'll be talking about subsequently, will look at that. Thank you. And on defense, it is not, again, it is not about picking, is it 2.4, 2.5%? We know that 2.5% by 2030 is now no longer enough. But we also know that our economy cannot support it. When I was in cabinet, we talked about getting to 3% and we couldn't make the numbers work. So if we're going to do this, let's start doing what I talked about in the speech. Let's start looking at welfare. In the short term, we can repurpose development aid, for example. But the Prime Minister has some difficult decisions in front of him. He needs to get serious, he needs to get real, and then we will support him in doing those. Shihab Khan, ITN.
Shihab Khan from ITV News. You've not given us a number there for how much you think defence spending needs to go up by. Is there roughly a figure that you think would be acceptable, and how much do you think the country could afford given its current position? And when you were in government just now, you've mentioned that Cabinet wanted to get it to 3% of GDP but wasn't able to do so. You're now talking about cutting welfare. Why didn't you do that at the time to make sure we could get to 3%?
Well, the world is changing. We can see what's happening with the invasion in Ukraine. But we did have a plan for welfare cuts. We did have a plan when we were going into the election. We lost the election. We are not in government now. We are in opposition. And what I'm standing here doing is explaining that the Conservative Party is under new leadership. We are reasserting the principles that we believe in so that people understand what we're about. We are now here to help keep the government, to hold the government to account, help them course correct where they're making the wrong decisions. That's my job, and that's what I'm doing. Martin Beckford, The Mail.
Thanks, Martin Beckford from the Daily Mail. As a former business secretary, I was just wondering what you made of the prospect of Britain being hit by reciprocal tariffs by President Trump. Is there any way we can avoid that, and what effect do you think it will have? The
best way that we can avoid tariffs is by signing a US-UK free trade agreement. And the last time President Trump was in power, when we had Prime Minister Boris Johnson, we were negotiating that. I saw the work that had been done. And President Biden scrapped that. What Keir Starmer needs to do now is to pick up where we left off and conclude that UK-US free trade agreement. But at the end of the day, tariffs are part of the WTO toolkit. As Trade Secretary, I saw when and how people can use them. Sometimes it's important to stop anti-dumping, for example. When other countries are breaking the rules, tariffs are a way for us to try and protect our economy and our industry. But overall, we should be looking at free trade. Thank you. Camilla Tominey, Telegraph.
Somebody Telegraph. You've been very vocal about the BBC documentary that's been branded Hamas propaganda. It's emerged that £400,000 of licence payers' cash may have been spent on it. You have tweeted, did any of this money end up in Hamas's hands? Is this now a subject that the Met Police must investigate under counter-terrorism laws? Well,
Camilla, we know that it is illegal to give money to terrorist organisations. Hamas is a terrorist organisation. The Met would make its operational decisions. I think that the BBC certainly needs to investigate and get the evidence for what has or what hasn't happened, and then the police can make a decision on that. But we know what is right and what is legal in our country, and giving money to terrorists is not it. And I have Martin Green from Policy Exchange.
Yes, it actually follows on from the last question. The problem is the BBC. The BBC used to be what I would call a respected neutral reporter. Today it's become, in my opinion, a follower of Hamas. It is corrupting our youth by being anti-Israel, anti-Zionism, and frankly, it makes those of us who are Zionist supporters uncomfortable. What's your attitude?
So I have always said that it was shocking that the BBC for a long time just would not even call Hamas a terrorist organization. We need our primary British media news institution to be able to tell the truth. Everything starts from truth, not shying away from it, not hiding from that. That's why, it's one of the reasons why I'm calling for an investigation and a review by the BBC, because this latest documentary is just the most recent in a long series of concerns we've had about reporting. It doesn't mean that the BBC is a terrible organisation. This is not an attack on the institution, but actually a plea for us to use those liberal values that I talked about us having in this country, about free speech, democratic accountability, to do the right thing. Let's have some truth. All right? Thank you very much, everybody.